I'll kick off. All right, so talk is called The Way is Shut, the American Legitimacy Crisis. It originates with a PhD thesis that I did at University of Cambridge in the politics department under the supervision of David Runciman. Some of it has been published. Some of it is in the process of maybe being published. There's a book. There are a couple of articles I'm working on. It's kind of the story. So to start, what is legitimacy and what's a legitimacy crisis? So post-1968, there was a lot of discussion about legitimacy. A lot of people may be familiar with Jürgen Habermas's book, Legitimacy Crisis. It came out in the early 70s, but he wasn't alone in this, nor was he the first to talk about legitimacy crises post-1968. You have American theorists like Robert Dahl talking about it, and you have Germans like Reinhard Koselleck, pictured here, talking about it. And the role of legitimacy in this period is it's the thing that prevents an acute crisis in Koselleck's work. An acute crisis is a moment of revolution or revolt. It's the fall of the political system, the succumbing of the political system to the tensions that are within it. So you start from a position of stability, but you get into a period where, as Koselleck argues, there's a moral dualism. There is some kind of tension between the story the state is telling about why it should be accepted and the beliefs of people in society about what makes a state or a political system or a regime acceptable. And in this period where there's this dualism and this tension between the state's narrative and the moral feeling of people, you're in the latent crisis. Now, during that latent crisis, there's an opportunity for the state to make some kind of intervention to correct the dualism, to bring its story back into alignment with the sentiments and feelings of the people. But if the state doesn't do that, if it fails to reconcile its narrative with the feelings of its population, then you move into the acute crisis. So in this kind of narrative of legitimacy crisis, you start from stability, you move into a period where there's a clear contradiction. And during that period, there's an opportunity to resolve the contradiction. But if you don't resolve the contradiction, it escalates and you get revolution or revolt. It's, in a way, a kind of simple model, right? The state has a position, the people have a position, those positions become different. There's a moment or a period where you can see that there's a difference. And then if you don't resolve the difference, it escalates. Importantly, the argument is that often it's the legitimation narrative of the state which gives rise to the specific criticisms that the people have. So if the state says, for instance, that it is legitimate because it promotes equality, for instance, it's going to be because the people have a different understanding of what equality means that you get this frustration. So the state will be acting in some ways under a different definition or a different conceptualization of the terms that it's using to justify itself from the way those terms are understood or used by the population. There's a development of the terms that the state invokes when it justifies itself in popular discourse, in civil society. And as the terms develop, they change in meaning, and that's how that gap opens up. And you see that not just in Koselleck, you see it in Robert Dahl, who during this period talks about, in the late 60s, there being a realization that there was a conflict between the state's claim to be this fair, equal, just society and a population which started to have understandings of fairness, equality, and justice, which were at odds with the state's actual behavior. All of that is then there and visible and present in Habermas's work, when Habermas says that over time there is a kind of a process of further democratization as ideas of democracy evolve or develop in society. People come to understand democracy in ways which don't fit with the actual democratic procedures, institutions, structures that they have. And so they then demand further democratization from the state. And if the state doesn't respond by giving them that further democratization, then it escalates into an acute crisis where the state has to use repressive modes to put down that rebellion. So in Habermas's theory, in Koslek's theory, in Dahl's theory, it's this same kind of arc where there's a period where there's a conflict over the term that is central to what the state is doing. And if that conflict does not get resolved, you go to revolution. So also during the 70s, we have Bernard Williams, but operating in British political thought. It takes a while for Bernard Williams to get around to legitimacy. And the book of his that talks about legitimacy is actually published after his death in 2005. Williams makes the argument that legitimacy crises are driven by resentment. And resentment can take a number of different forms. But for Williams, they're all connected ultimately, because all of these forms of resentment stem from the same ultimate sources of dissatisfaction. So in the beginning, when the population begins to resent the government, it disapproves in principle of what the government is doing, but not on procedural grounds. So if you disagree with a law that the government passes, or you disagree with the outcome of an election, but you still think that the system through which the laws are passed is acceptable, or you think that the electoral system through which candidates are elected is okay, that would be where you're at, disapproving in principle, but not on procedural grounds. The next step up is to view something as both procedurally and in principle objectionable. So you not only think that the law is wrong, you disagree with the legal system, with the legal process in some way. You think that there is something wrong with the way the law was passed. Maybe you think that the legislature is structured in a way that biases it toward particular interests. Maybe you think that the rules are unfair in some way, or the rules are poorly enforced. The next step up is to say that all the procedures are a sham, that you don't just say have a problem with the electoral system or with the particular way in which the branches of government are structured or share power, but you think the whole system, all of it, is a problem, and that the whole thing needs to be restructured, that you need a new constitution, for instance. Beyond that, you would get total lack of identification with the political system, right? So you can think that you need a new constitution to make democracy functional and still be committed to democracy. But if you have a total lack of identification with the political system, then you don't want to fix the system by writing a new constitution or creating a new set of procedures. You want to replace the system with a different system that's fundamentally different in kind, right? So if you're an authoritarian and you want to throw out democracy in favor of Soviet-style communism, or Mussolini or Hitler-style fascism, that's total lack of identification with the system. That's not just feeling that all procedures are a sham. It goes a step beyond, right? So if you could think about these different levels of resentment as levels of legitimacy, right? So in the Koslek vision, there's stability, there's latent crisis, and then there's acute. But if we take these levels of resentment as 4 different levels, we get this kind of structure, right? So in perfect legitimacy, you have no problems with anything the state does. Everything the state does strikes you as acceptable. Perfect legitimacy doesn't exist. It's a utopian condition, straightforwardly. Full legitimacy, you have issues with some of the things that the state does, some of its acts, but you accept the procedures by which the state determines how it's going to act, right? Now, full legitimacy is about as good as it ever gets in practice. We never get a society where everyone agrees with everything the state does. But you can aim for a society where, while people may not like some of the things the state does, they think the rules by which the state issues decisions are broadly fair. A step below that would be minimal legitimacy. Now, with minimal legitimacy, you're to the stage where you're starting to feel that the procedures themselves are a problem, that the way the state makes decisions is not right, that some of the procedures are rigged, some of them need to be changed, some of them are unfair, maybe lots of them are unfair. At liminal legitimacy, you're ready to stage a revolution or revolt in favor of an alternative kind of political system, right? So if you think about minimal legitimacy, you might think of it as in some way corresponding to the latent crisis. But with the latent crisis, that's a period that ends in liminal legitimacy unless you act. So the assumption there is that once you're in minimal legitimacy, you're headed for liminal unless you do something to avoid going there. Now, my supervisor, David Runciman, was a bit influenced by the thinking of Francis Fukuyama in his End of History. And in Fukuyama's End of History, he argues that we've come to a point where there is a restricted political imaginarium, where we are no longer really able to imagine alternative political systems that we think are viable to liberal democracy or to capitalist democracy, however you might want to put that. Right? So if you think that there is no viable alternative to liberal democracy or to capitalism, then you can't participate in a revolution or revolt. You can't imagine a revolution or revolt that ends in any kind of positive way. So no matter how much you resent the procedures, and no matter how deep your resentment goes, you're not able to support an alternative political system, and therefore you're not able to support revolution or revolt. In his 2008 book, The Confidence Trap, David argues that because liberal democracy has outlasted fascist states, has outlasted the Soviet Union, that there's a confidence trap. There's a feeling that no matter how bad it gets, liberal democracy will and capitalism will somehow survive whatever crisis occurs. And therefore, crises are not opportunities to have a revolution and pick a new system. They are simply unpleasant things that you have to muddle through or get through, and which the system will inevitably survive. Now, of course, because you have this confidence that the system will survive, you can be complacent, and that can cause you to not act in situations where maybe you should. But even if you don't act, if people really can't imagine any other kind of political system, if there really is no alternative politically to capitalist liberal democracy, then you can't get a revolution or revolt. And no matter how bad it gets, you remain committed to, at most, procedural reform, right? So these two things collide with each other. This feeling of resentment that all the procedures are a sham on the one side, and this sense of democratic embeddedness, that there is no alternative, that democracy is the only or final system of government, that there is nothing else that you can do. And so what I argue is that this kind of gets you stuck in minimal legitimacy, right? Resentment makes it impossible to get to full legitimacy. There is too much feeling in our society that the procedures are rigged, that they're unfair, that they don't work for various different reasons, from various different points of view. People feel that the procedures are rigged or dysfunctional. However, there is still this feeling that revolution, revolt, civil war, none of that will lead anywhere positive. And because people feel these things simultaneously, they stay at this level of minimal legitimacy for an extended period of time. And when you stay in the period of minimal legitimacy and you don't go to the acute crisis, you're not in a latent crisis. It's not something that's leading to something acute. What you have is a new distinctive kind of legitimacy crisis that is chronic in character, that is just kind of always there, that is never resolved, because to resolve it, you'd have to get to full legitimacy, and which never issues in the collapse that you would associate with liminal legitimacy, right? Now, in this kind of situation, there is a commitment to democracy because there's no alternative, but the definition of democracy is unclear. The procedural form that democracy should take is heavily debated, heavily contested. And because the one thing everybody's sure about is that a revolution or a civil war would produce a terrible cataclysm, and that authoritarian regimes are no good and shouldn't be embraced, the most effective way that you can oppose other people's procedural reforms is to suggest that they are not, in fact, committed to democracy, but committed to some authoritarian system. So if you don't like somebody's procedural reform, you suggest that they are a communist, that they're a fascist, that they're a tanky, that they are a supporter of some kind of bad authoritarianism. And if you do that, then their reforms become a route to an acute crisis that nobody wants. And that becomes a basis for preventing those particular procedural reforms. And because the definition of democracy itself becomes unclear, it's very hard to prove decisively during the period of chronic crisis that any particular reform is in fact an authoritarian reform or is in fact compatible with democracy. There's too much debate about what democracy means to sort it out in any kind of definitive way. And ultimately, the view that you're going to have about whether a particular procedural reform is or isn't compatible with democracy is going to depend on your own point of view, your own values, your own understanding of what democracy means. And any attempt to universalize any of that, to get a consensus on any of that, is an attempt to get to full legitimacy. And the trouble is, all of the different procedural reforms that we try don't tend to deal with the fundamental sources of resentment. And there are lots of different views that people may have about the fundamental sources of resentment. If you adopt a kind of left-wing or Marxist critique of capitalism, then the only way that you could deal with the sources of resentment would be to deal with the alienation and exploitation which the capitalist system visits upon people. Since lots of different procedural reforms are compatible with exploitation and alienated labor and with capitalist labor relations, procedural reforms to democracy do not tend to resolve the causes of resentment. They paper over those causes in ways which tend to eventually wear thin. They may buy some time, they may buy a moment where people think that the procedural reform is going to allow eventually for more substantive changes to be made that would alleviate the real sources of their discontent. But generally speaking, procedural reforms don't actually solve the resentments that they're introduced to resolve, at least not in a permanent long-term way. That would be my argument. But of course, part of the character of this crisis is that we're not going to agree on why we are feeling resentment. We're not going to agree on the cause because we don't agree on what democracy is, on what's wrong with it. That level of deep pluralism and deep antagonism about why we are in the crisis, what the crisis means, that's all characteristic of being at this level. If it was the case that any one person could straightforwardly persuade everybody of one account of why we're in the crisis, then it would be easy for us to get to full legitimacy. We just have to implement that straightforward set of reforms, and everybody would be happy. What's characteristic of the chronic crisis is that you can't do this. There's too much disagreement to get everybody on board with one particular set of solutions. The resentment is caused by too many different things. It's too complicated. It is not simple enough for that. So that's what the chronic crisis is. The next stage in the discussion, we're going to talk a little bit about how precisely legitimacy works. What are these stories, these accounts that states tell to persuade people to accept them? And if you're in this chronic crisis, how might those stories or accounts change or evolve to try to either prolong the period of time in which you can be in a chronic crisis or attempt to move toward full legitimacy and stable politics? So Williams has a view about what legitimation stories are. He argues for there to be a legitimate government, there must be a legitimation story, which explains why state power can be used to coerce some people rather than others, and to allow people to restrict other people's freedom in some ways rather than others. Now, the key thing I want to point out here is this language, a legitimate government, a legitimation story, right? One story for one government. Now, if it is the case that you can tell one story and that one story can do the work of legitimating the government, well, you have a relatively straightforward way of securing legitimacy. This does not suggest that level of straightforwardness. the fact that there's an unclear definition of democracy and intense procedural contestation from lots of different directions at once suggests that people have different stories, different views about why a democracy would be legitimate or what it is that would make democracy legitimate. So it's not just going to be one story. There's going to have to be lots of different stories that are told at once. And then there's this question of, well, what if these stories are not true? What if these stories are forms of propaganda? What if they're ideological? And so at this point, I want to talk a little bit about how legitimacy and ideology relate to one another. Because oftentimes, these two discussions don't come together. Often, Marxists who find the concept of ideology meaningful think legitimacy is a bourgeois concept, and liberals who find the concept of legitimacy meaningful think that ideology is a kind of loaded concept that assumes that people are false conscious or not able to think for themselves. So I think we can get past these kind of stereotypes that are thrown back and forth between the two discussions. On something resembling Althusser's account of ideology, ideology constitutes subjects in such a way that they believe they freely choose their own beliefs. So if you're telling people a legitimation story and you're structuring their life in such a way that they cannot help but believe the story, but you lead them to believe that they've freely chosen to believe the legitimation story, in some ways, then the story is the product of a coercive process. And if the story is a product of a coercive process, theorists of ideology want to say that that means that it's fundamentally ideological and that there's something fundamentally illegitimate about trying to force people to acquiesce to the state by manipulating the way that they think from a very early age. Right? Now, ideology accomplishes what repression accomplishes by alternative means. So if we go back to the very early, the acute crisis is what happens if you don't handle the latent crisis. From the point of view of a theory of ideology, in the latent crisis, you might tell new stories or better stories that cause people to come back into alignment with the state story. So you might adjust the state story in such a way that you can triangulate between the values that the society has and the narrative that the state is telling. And in that way, by triangulating between those positions, you might get them back into alignment and avoid the acute crisis. In a similar kind of way, that gets you out of it without having to go into the acute crisis, without having to go into the revolution and into revolt. So in this way, ideology, like legitimacy, is the thing that prevents revolution or revolt. But of course, theorists of ideology frame this in a more critical, negative way. Ideology is a bad thing that stops the revolution that otherwise would, could, should happen from happening. Right? So if we are deceived into accepting a false legitimation story, we are deceived through ideology. The question then is, well, how would you distinguish between a legitimation story that is true or valid or something that we ought to affirm, and one that is ideology that is a mystification? And the difficulty is it's going to be very difficult to draw any kind of line between true and false legitimation stories. And this is something that has been talked about for a very long time, and there are lots of different theories through which you could discuss why it is that it's difficult to cleanly distinguish between true and false legitimation stories. I've gone with Max Weber here, and a quote from Science and a Vocation, in which Weber says, "As science does not, who is to answer the question, what shall we do, and how shall we arrange our lives? Or, in the words used here tonight, which of the warring gods should we serve? Or should we serve perhaps an entirely different God, and who is he? Then one can say that only a prophet or a savior can give the answers. If there is no such man, or if his message is no longer believed in, then you will certainly not compel him to appear on this earth by having thousands of professors, as privileged hirelings of the state, attempt as petty prophets in their lecture rooms to take over his role. All they will accomplish is to show that they are unaware of the decisive state of affairs. The prophet for whom so many of our younger generation yearn simply does not exist. So this point about warring gods, different kinds of narratives about why it is that states should exist, if they should exist. And of course, there's some people who will say that there are no legitimation stories that could possibly be true, that every legitimation story is a form of ideology. So there isn't going to be some kind of cut and dry way of drawing a line. And there are people in the academy who have tried in recent years to argue that there are ways to say, which legitimation stories should be regarded as ideological. Bernard Williams, for instance, has something he calls the critical theory principle, in which he says a legitimation story does not count if people have been forced to accept it. The question then is, well, what counts as forced? And there will be, of course, further disagreements about what counts as forcing someone to accept. So even if you try to lay out some kind of principle for distinguishing between stories that might potentially be true and stories that are definitely false, there will be further questions that will be kicked up about any particular device you use to draw that line. In more recent years, in 2017, there was an article by Prince and Rossi in which they argue that you could use a kind of epistemic criteria. Instead of saying, well, the state is legitimate if it accords with some particular set of true or right moral values, they argue that you ought to put whatever terms the state invokes in an epistemic test, that you ought to look at the history of the term and how it's been used historically. And on the basis of that, you can say, well, has the term been used in a way that's misleading? But of course, there will be disagreement about whether historically particular terms have been used in a misleading way. People who look at the history of terms will not all have the same attitude to the terms after having examined the history. And B, you can apply that same kind of epistemic test to the concept of epistemology, and you can talk about knowledge itself as potentially the product of legitimation stories and ideological narratives. So there isn't any way of cleanly resolving this. And therefore, I think it's very, very difficult to imagine one particular story or narrative that you could find that would get you back to something resembling full legitimacy, stable politics, substantive policy debates. Very, very hard. So the way I like to think about legitimation stories is that they kind of have three composite parts. A state's act is the first part. Then there's a particular abstraction that is used to justify it. The state does this thing to advance this value. Now, we can, of course, disagree about which particular values are important and which particular legitimating abstractions should be invoked to justify the acts of states. And we will disagree heavily about that. Some of us, for instance, will think that the state should act on the basis of what advances liberty or equality or peace or prosperity. There are lots of different abstractions that you might use to talk about whether a particular use of power is acceptable or not acceptable. But then beyond that, you've also got conceptualizations. Any given abstraction that you might use to justify a state's act can be conceptualized in a large number of ways, and those conceptualizations can all conflict with each other, right? So in the rest of these talks that we're going to do, we're going to be talking a lot about the United States in particular as the kind of example case, in part because of my familiarity with it, in part because it's a very prominent case. And even if you're from another country, it's highly likely that you will have heard plenty about the United States and have some level of information about it because of its level of power and influence in the world and its ability to affect politics of lots of other countries. We're going to talk about some of the abstractions that you used a lot in liberal legitimation stories in the United States. We'll start with liberty, and then we'll move to equality, and then we'll move to representation. And we'll talk about the different conceptualizations of each of these legitimating abstractions, the different ways the terms can be understood. Now, oftentimes when there are discussions in the literature about the different ways the term can be understood, they're normative discussions about how it should be understood, with people arguing for the particular conceptualizations that they think are better and trying to win the argument and bring people into a consensus on a particular understanding of the term. In these talks, I'm going to operate from the premise that that kind of agreement is not possible, that these terms are fundamentally contested because we're in a chronic legitimacy crisis. And therefore, not only is democracy contested, and not only is there disagreement about which legitimating abstractions ought to be used in justificatory narratives for democracy, but also that different conceptualizations of the terms will be constantly put in conflict with one another in a bid to try to push the state to meet particular people's very, very divergent values. So some of the questions will kick up and that are kicked up when you talk about these terms. With liberty, you may be familiar with debate about ancient or modern liberty, and Benjamin Constant will talk a little bit about that, about whether liberty is positive or negative. These are related discussions, but they're different. Ancient liberty is to do with participating in politics, being able to be part of politics. Modern liberty is typically framed in terms of a private sphere in which you're not interfered with by politics, and you can do other things that are viewed or conceptualized as non-political. Positive or negative liberty, again, positive is about what you can do, what you're able to do. Negative is about not being interfered with. But then there's also other ways of conceptualizing liberty in reference to ancient Roman notions of slavery and domination. And we're going to get into efforts to revive some of these other understandings of liberty, efforts to bring them back, efforts to make liberty something that is very different from the kind of concept that it's been over the last 50, 60, 70 years. And we're going to talk about whether those efforts can succeed and some of the obstacles that get in the way. And that, of course, also includes Marx's understanding of liberty, which recent scholarship suggests was heavily influenced by neo-Roman ideas. We're going to talk about equality. Equality, there are an enormous number of different debates within equality. And because there are so many debates, Karl Marx was very opposed to the use of equality as a key term because it's so easy to change and modify that term in a variety of different ways. We're going to talk about how vested interests, the wealthy, oligarchs, influence and manipulate the way equality is conceptualized by straightforwardly using money to fund organizations and outfits that push particular conceptualizations of equality. We're going to talk about equality in relation to equity. We're going to talk about debates about the currency of justice. Is equality a matter of welfare? Is it a matter of resources? Equality among whom? Should we be talking about equality among citizens? Should we be talking about equality among human beings? The distributive principle is, should we be following a principle of strict equality, giving people exactly the same amount of things? Should we be following a principle of priority, trying to improve the position of the worst off, even if there's some level of inequality in the schema when we do that? Is equality valuable for intrinsic reasons? Is it a freestanding value in its own right, or for instrumental reasons, perhaps because it facilitates getting a particular kind of liberty that you might want? And then we're going to get into representation in the final session. We're going to talk about representation as an acting for or standing for concept. So for instance, in a lot of our discussions, that we think about representation in terms of delegates or trustees, right? So a delegate is somebody who does what you want them to do. You tell them what you want, and then they go and do it. A trustee is someone that you have put your trust in to kind of think for you. You defer to their judgment. They're acting on the basis of what they take to be your interest, but you don't tell them what to do. You think that they know more than you do, and so you defer to their opinion, right? A lot of the time in poli-sci undergrad programs, representation gets positioned as a delegate thing or a trustee thing. But these are both conceptions of representation which are focused around acting for. How does the representative act for the represented, right? But there's also this other notion of representation that's become increasingly important and increasingly used by the state to justify itself, which is a kind of standing for representation that can be descriptive or symbolic. So descriptive representation is when the representative in some way is said to look like you or sound like you or to be part of your group. So it's not that they know something about your interest necessarily and act on the basis of that, or that they're doing what it is that you ask them to do, but you're meant to feel represented by them purely because they look like you, sound like you, or in some nominal way come from your group. And that is meant to make you feel like you're there, that you're part of things, even if they may not act in any way that is influenced at all by what you want or by what is in your interest. And then symbolic representation. Symbolic representation is focused around representing abstractions, representing kind of abstract unities. So someone who claims to represent the people or represent the state or represent some value, that person is not framing themselves as representing your interests or representing your desires, and they're not framing themselves as looking like you, sounding like you, acting like you. They're trying to get you to buy into an abstract concept and then view that abstract concept as distilled in their person, right? So in both of those cases, you have someone who's standing for some group of people or some particular abstract idea, but they may not be acting for any particular person or set of people. Or the people that they are acting for may be completely different from the people that they are suggesting that they stand for. So we're going to talk about kind of gaps that open up between who you act for, who you stand for. And we're also going to talk about a decline in the capacity of the American state to act. So one of the consequences of this kind of deep disagreement is that it becomes harder, especially in the American political system, which is bogged down in multiple different layers of government, federal, state, local, and also has a bicameral legislature in which the two houses have different electoral rules governing who gets elected. And therefore, it's very often the case that there are different parties in control of the two houses, or that the president is different from the party that controls both of the houses. All of those things make it harder for the United States to act when there's a lot of internal division in the country. And since in a chronic legitimacy crisis, there's so much disagreement about so many things, you get into a situation where there's less capacity, state capacity, for the United States to act. And therefore, it becomes necessary, as the capacity of the state to act declines, for it to pitch itself as representing in a standing for sense, that it stands for people. And that leads to more of a kind of cultural emphasis in which the representatives are trying to mirror the particular cultural values, norms, attitudes of particular parts of the population, rather than doing anything that might, say, alleviate the sources of resentment that tend to drive these crises. Now, while we're going to talk about those three things over the course of the next few sessions, I do want you to bear in mind that that's not all that's out there, right? And it's also not all that's in play even in this legitimacy crisis. There are a lot of other abstractions that play important roles in justifying states, apart from liberty, equality, and representation. While there is a tendency to want to emphasize those concepts in the United States, particularly in American high culture, because those concepts are closely tied into liberalism and into the history of liberalism, those concepts are always in some ways competing with other abstractions that have historically played significant roles and continue to play significant roles. And if you have a hard time conceptualizing liberty, equality, and representation in persuasive ways, there's a tendency for, among ordinary people, for these other abstractions to pop out and become more important and to become more part of the ordinary conversation. So if we think about, say, ancient abstractions, the kinds of abstractions that would be used in ancient Rome, in ancient Greece, in pre-Christian societies, in non-Western states, in other parts of the world, what we often will see is an emphasis on concepts like peace, concepts of prosperity, concepts of justice. And of course, there is a large variety of different ways that peace, prosperity, and justice can be conceptualized. But one of the things that I will point out about ancient abstractions is that they are more connected to discrete physical realities than the liberal triad. You can try to say that war is peace, and there are Roman emperors who will claim that they have an all-embracing peace that defends against the barbarians, or that they've pacified a province by invading it and subjugating it. You certainly can claim that war is peace and peace is war. But it's harder to do that with these concepts because they are more discretely tied to particular conditions on the ground. It's very hard to tell people if you're in an economic collapse that they have prosperity, that the state is achieving prosperity. It's a much harder thing to bend or play with. The liberal triad is a little bit more flexible. It's easier to frame a larger number of different situations as potentially compatible with the liberal triad than with peace, prosperity, and justice. We've also got the medieval abstractions, God and nature. If you look at arguments from the Middle Ages about why states are legitimate, they tend to focus very heavily on true religion or on natural law. There are people who still view these abstractions as very important, especially in the United States. When we're talking about the United States, you can't leave out that there's a sizable number of religious conservatives in the United States for whom Thomas Aquinas's account of the state is still important. And so we can't cross those out or write those off. They still have a role to play in talking about what goes on in the United States, and they still get invoked. Then there are mediating abstractions, and I give a few of these here: family, fandoms, futurism. These are things that you might think of as something you might do in your private life. You might go and start a family in part because you're dissatisfied with politics and you'd rather be thinking about domestic life than political life. You might get heavily invested in fandoms, in different kinds of entertainment media, in sports teams, in particular franchises of films or television, a series of novels. These are, you might imagine kind of that you're part of a community of fans around these things, and that might give you something else to be concerned about apart from politics. It might enable you to better cope with a society that you feel is deeply unfair. And then you've also got the concept of the future. A lot of tech workers, for instance, who work for Meta and Twitter and these big tech billionaires, the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musk, and so on, they think they're part of constructing a future, some kind of other better world that will come to pass through their labors. And so even if they may feel unhappy with the way politics works in their own time, they can defer gratification and imagine that by being part of this future, that they're constructing something that will be better down the line. Now, the reason I call these things mediating abstractions is because they often involve institutions or interests that may seem or strike one as private or oriented toward the private sector. And therefore, if you are committed to being a fan of Elon Musk, or you're committed to being a fan of Star Wars, or you're committed to raising children in a family, you may think that your concern is not a political concern. But of course, the reason then that you are accepting the political system is that the political system has allowed you space to get involved with, to construct, to be part of a family, a fandom, or a vision of the future. And so in that case, those things are still doing the work of legitimating the state to you, but they're doing it in a mediated way. If you've become too alienated from the state to straightforwardly buy into any of the political narratives, the political legitimation stories, then you're invited to buy into one of these mediating abstractions that gets you to buy into the political system through a more complicated means that involves invoking notions of the private. Right? So that's the kind of broad menu. But of course, to do all of these abstractions justice would be very difficult. At this stage, I just want to kind of raise the point that there's a lot of other stuff in play apart from the liberal triad. And if we have questions about that stuff, I'll do my best to talk about that. And I think that questions about that stuff should come up now rather than in the other sessions, where we'll be more focused on going into the liberal triad in depth and really exploring the specific games that are going on in the United States, the specific struggles that are going on over which of those abstractions should be given the greatest importance and how those abstractions should be conceptualized. That's broadly where I'm going with this. And a lot of the basic terms here are introduced in this first talk. Terms like, what is a legitimation story? What is a legitimating abstraction? What's a conceptualization of legitimating abstraction? I've done a lot of the groundwork here, so it's important to get comfortable with all of those terms for the purposes of the remaining talks. So especially if we have any points of confusion about some of the abstract concepts I've introduced, I would be very keen to answer questions related to any lack of clarity there. But any other questions anybody may have, I would certainly be happy to answer at this stage.
That's great. Thanks so much, Benjamin. Super interesting. And I have loads of questions, but I obviously don't want to hog the floor, as I always do that. So does anybody have anything for Benjamin? I mean, the one that came to mind when you were just talking at the end is about the mediating fandoms, future, and what was the third one?
Futurism. Yeah.
Futurism, fandom, and family, right? Yeah. Because I mean, it seems like this is really something that's characterizing our present moment today. And even in politics, a lot of politics operates as fandoms. We've talked a lot about AOC before and Trump and figures like that become, like Marvel characters almost for some people. Do you think there's a reason why it's that particular legitimation mechanism is happening today?
Yeah, so I think that people get to a point where they fall into despair. If you play the politics game long enough, you eventually get to a point where you realize that you're not going to win the argument. You're not going to persuade everybody to accept one particular conceptualization of your preferred abstraction. There isn't going to be one sublime object of ideology that everybody buys into. And so you get to a point where you then move into a kind of practical attitude of, well, can I support something that might make things marginally better, that might marginally improve material conditions in some way for people. And what you will tend to find over time is that very little of what you do, especially in the United States, because of the levels, the sheer number of seats that have to be won in the United States for anything to happen, very little of what goes on in American politics actually administers to the needs of people in the United States. And so if you do try to get the system to do anything, what you will tend to find is not only does it not respond to you, it doesn't do very much at all for anybody anymore. It's very sclerotic, very slow moving, not really responsive to any particular set of demands. Even very wealthy people in the United States burn enormous amounts of money every election cycle, totally fruitlessly, getting people elected who do very little even for them most of the time. So it's a system that doesn't really reward you for trying. And so I think the kind of reasonable response to that is to get into a state of political despair and a feeling of negativity. But of course, it's hard as a human being to feel despair about the thing that you're orienting your life around for a long period of time. That's not very easy to sustain. So what people will tend to do is they'll pivot from that negativity into one of those Fs and start kind of trying to build an enclave in the private sphere in which they can get the things and get the values that they're not getting from politics. The trouble, of course, is that private sphere always has always depended on politics and on the state. And the problems with the state inevitably affect all of those enclaves and hidey holes. And so people get dragged back in through those other things, often against their will, into engaging with politics, until again, there's another round of dissatisfaction and despair. But by that point, people are much older and there aren't as many of them. How many people stay with all of this long enough to go through all of those levels of despair and get to the end? It's not enough to cause any trouble really to this system.
Yeah, and presumably, things like therapy culture that's come up so much today, focusing on, issues of subjectivity and, you know, self-improvement and stuff refers to that. So Alfie, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, is it okay, the sound? I'm in the airport, so it might not be. Can you hear me? Is it fine or not? Oh, it is fine.
Yeah,
okay, great. Yeah,
yeah, it is fine.
great. I think slight lag, but I'll just keep going. Yeah, Ben, it's really great. I mean, I guess you partly answered half of what I was going to ask about, which was to do with these kind of 3 Fs, I guess. But I guess I was also thinking when you started talking about how legitimation, whatever it was, legitimation story relates to the discourse around capitalist realism, you know, because on the one hand, like, I'm sure you know all this stuff, but like, you know, the idea of capitalist realism, of like capitalism's ability to kind of like smooth over and provide a kind of right its detractors back into its story, is obviously part of what you're thinking about through Raymond Williams and legitimation story and so on. So there's a connection there in some ways. And I guess you just finished by speaking about these 3 Fs or whatever, which would be a really nice example of this, where something which is perceived of by the person doing it as perhaps rebellious against the political centre is in fact sort of, what did you call it, a mediated abstraction, which is bringing you back in through an alternative mechanism or whatever. But what I wanted to ask you was, earlier on in the talk, you said that you couldn't have a revolution unless if people couldn't kind of imagine an alternative, as it were. You were talking about the fact that you would need a kind of ability to imagine or resist, you know. And I wondered if this, in fact, does tally or not, because on the one hand, you've got a certain strand of Marxists who would say that you can have a revolution only when you can't imagine an alternative. So you've got, on the one hand, complete legitimation story or complete capitalist realism, but then nevertheless you've got a rupture from which revolution emerges precisely when it can't be imagined, right? When there is no alternative. Whereas it seems like what you were saying earlier on was that you do in fact need to put together the kind of conscious rather than unconscious building blocks of revolutionary thought. So I guess there's a question there, but also just a comment on, can you comment on how it relates to ideas of capitalist realism, but also, do you think it's possible to have this kind of revolutionary outburst even when you can't imagine an alternative in the way you were talking about before?
Yeah, I think one of the things that makes it very difficult for revolution to come off is that while there is a despair that is created by sustained engagement with this system, it does make sure that people always have something to lose, namely the opportunity to do those Fs. This idea that you might be able to, have a family, that you might be able to, see the next movie or watch the next season of your favorite sports team. The idea that there might at some point something in the future might change, might be different. Whereas if you go out into the street and you start a revolution, or you try to start a revolution, odds are you're going to be arrested and put in prison, and then you're really not going to have any possibility. And so because I think there's always this fantasy, even among people who have a lot of despair about politics, that there's something they can do for them. Even if it's not for everybody, there's some way that they can manage. That private sphere becomes a bulwark ultimately against the kind of despair that might lead people to politically innovate and try to come up with some sort of more comprehensive alternative that is really scalable. I do think there's a lot of overlap, of course, with realists in this work. What I've kind of tried to do is bridge some of the splits I see between realists and Marxists. I think that kind of the liberal realists are right to point out that this system is very resilient and really hard to knock off. At the same time, the Marxists are right to point out that this system really does create deep feelings of despair and misery in large numbers of people. And so what I've tried to come up with is a schema which takes seriously the degree to which this system immiserates people and its tankiness and the difficulty of actually overthrowing it or replacing it with something else. I think a lot of Marxists, their tendency is to think, well, if it immiserates people, then the fact that it immiserates people makes it something that can be replaced. And conversely, a lot of liberal realists will go, well, if it can survive all sorts of stuff, then it must be taking well enough care of people that they don't rebel or revolt. I'm trying to fully incorporate the sense in which this thing can't be moved and the sense in which that's horrifying at the same time.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a really good answer.
Great. Jonathan, do you wanna go for it?
Yeah. So when you're talking about the end of history and how we can't even picture a better future, I think that there's an idea out there that all we need is a better narrative. Like every Adam Curtis documentary ends with "It's bad to quantify people. Also, we need a new story," and kind of activism as well, particularly particularly now, but the activism of the last 20 years is about consciousness raising, which is part of implementing a better story, I would argue. But these things don't really seem to be working. So is there kind of a trap here as we're trying to get a better story out, as we're trying to generate a better story? How can we perhaps escape the trap, or traps plural? If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so part of what I am hoping to get into in the next few sessions is how precisely these struggles over concepts go. Because I think a lot of people will look at this and go, well, okay, well, we just need kind of a better story, as you say, and let's come up with it and let's disseminate it. But of course, there's a political economy involved in constructing stories and disseminating them. And for this reason, in the struggles over how the terms are going to be conceptualized or which terms are going to be considered important, having money matters a lot for how all of that shakes out. And I think what we've seen over the last 50 years or so is a number of different efforts to introduce and tell new stories, many of which seem perfectly credible and plausible at first, but which are then messed with by rich people in such a way that they stop functioning in the way that they were originally intended to function. Either they get replaced by something else, or they get kind of bent or turned. So in particular, when we talk about equality, I'm going to talk about equity and how equity was introduced to change the equality debate. And then through the power of rich people money, it was bent into something which completely reifies the existing system and totally fits and slots right into it. And the problem is, if you're approaching this from the point of view of let's just find a better story, once you then get into the competition over which stories are going to be powerful, it will then matter that you are not in a position materially to compete with the people who disseminate the stories.
Another question, which I'm sure you'll get into in future sessions, but I'll try asking it now, is if I'm hanging out with a bunch of young Marxists, the 20-year-olds or whatever, and then some probably older as well, then they'll say, well, we just need a revolution, an armed revolution. That's it. So that's going to be coming around the corner. It's going to be happening any day now. Is that at all realistic in the United States, in the context of the US?
Well, I think in the States, we get, we do have some groups of young Marxists in the States. It's not as if we don't have any. But they tend to be a little bit fan-to-me because they kind of hang out with each other. And because they hang out with each other and talk to each other a lot, what seems possible or likely to them is often to some ways at odds with what seems possible or likely to the ordinary person or to any of the people who would be in position potentially to carry off a revolution. So when I have conversations with people who think it's possible, I go, well, all right, those ideas have penetrated in the groups that you're in. Have they penetrated in the military? In the Bolshevik Revolution, a significant part of the army defects and joins the revolutionaries. Are there substantial numbers of people who are in a position to actually fight the state who have these kinds of views? And then you got to bear in mind that we're 100 years further along in military technology, and having infantry with small arms is no longer all that consequential at this stage because we are kind of beyond the mass mobilization, very large infantry armies of the World War I era. At this point, a lot of the most important and critical kinds of military technology cannot easily be seized by even parts of the military which might be interested in defecting. So it's a lot harder to pull off a revolution when you start to dig into the mechanics of, how does it actually happen? Well, you have a lot, first you have to persuade people to do a general strike. Then the military has to refuse the orders to shoot the strikers, and instead it has to join them, or some part of the military has to join them. And if that part isn't big enough, then you have a civil war. And you have to get through that. And even in, say, the Bolshevik scenario, you got a civil war and years of chaos and violence. So I think a lot of the time, especially, we don't really have a frame of reference for what all this involves. A lot of the people who participated in the revolutions of the early 20th century had been in trenches, had military training, had lived in miserable conditions. For many of them, miserable conditions were very normal. The miserable conditions of a civil war for control of the state were not that different from the miserable conditions in the trench fighting the other side in the First World War. So these are some of the background conditions. Also in the interwar period, we had a collapse because of the First World War, and then again in the 30s because of the competition over trade that developed in the 30s in response to the Depression, a collapse in trade before there was revolutionary violence. Whereas right now, if you were to start revolutionary violence, that would be the cause of a collapse in trade and a collapse in living standards. Similarly, if you were to pass really major left-wing economic reforms, that would disrupt trade and disrupt living standards. And then politically, you have to answer for that at the polls. In these other contexts where revolution has been successful, you've already had disruption to those things. The disruption can be blamed on other people. It doesn't fall on the revolutionary or the reformer. And so the revolutionary reformer could position themselves as having a common sense set of solutions to the situation created by the mismanagement of others. From our standpoint, we've got all of these, all this capital mobility, all this trade, intricate supply chains that have been created in part because their disruption is catastrophic from the point of view of most ordinary people. And so if the revolutionary is in the near term making people much worse off on the basis of a notion of the future, that's a much tougher sell.
Great, thanks very much. We just have our last question from Micah.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, thank you, Benjamin, and thanks everyone. It was really good. I guess it's a comment question, maybe having something to do with representation, which I know you'll get to maybe in the last. But I was thinking of procedural reform and contestation that you mentioned, and I read and heard you talk about very well the primary system in the United States and how structurally that's and I was just thinking that, like, I feel like out of what maybe the menu of proposals for reform are sort of discussed, the primary system is never one of them. And I'm just wondering if we could think about maybe the coercive powers behind that, and why that's never discussed. And I think it might have something to do with these definitions of representation.
Yeah, for sure. So one of the things that I think has happened in the States is that the primary system has become viewed as the only democratic way of choosing candidates. If you use some kind of committee that meets in a smoke-filled room, that is viewed as fundamentally undemocratic or corrupt at this point in American politics. So you will find some people who do propose to modify the primary system, but the modifications they'll propose will always be about further democratizing the primaries, making them more open, allowing independents or people who aren't even registered as supporters of the party in question to vote in them. So they're always about opening it up wider to even more people, rather than, say, closing it down and making it into something more resembling a European political party. I think that developed, out of the 1968 crisis, in which you had George Wallace running as a third-party candidate, winning a number of states in the South, coming not getting there, but coming close to precipitating a situation in which the election would be thrown to the House, and Southerners in the House would be able to hold the two parties to ransom on the segregation issue in exchange for their votes. And so in response to that, and in the riots in Chicago, there was this need to come up with a narrative for how the candidate selection process was democratic, so that people would not be drawn in large numbers toward third-party and independent candidates. And that's been extremely successful in the United States. At this point, I think going back to anything resembling the pre-68 system or something like a European members-based system is totally off the menu. A lot of US states have laws now which make it illegal to start a members-based party that picks candidates without a primary system, that subjects all parties in the state to the kind of open or closed primary rules that state uses. So at this point, a lot of states have preempted those kinds of reforms. And so it becomes a catch-22 where you would need to capture the two parties effectively to introduce the kinds of reforms which would make third parties possible. And so you get pushed into the same fundamental situation reformers in the United States have faced for the last 30, 40 years or so, which is how do you actually get a third party that's competitive, where you're actually able to pick the candidates and they're not picked on the basis of who has the most money to donate to the primary campaign.
Great. Anybody got any more questions? Otherwise, we'll wrap it up there and then meet next week. Oh yeah, go for it.
I don't know if I have like one question or maybe a comment or a reflection, because I think this is really interesting, and I'm thinking a lot because I'm from Chile. I'm more familiarized with that, with the political crisis that we have like this couple of years and the referendum this year that finally reject the new constitution. And it's interesting for me to think, for example, in the scale of the country to understand this political crisis, because I don't know, I think it could be different in a country like Chile that we are 17 millions in relation with US with hundreds of millions, and states that are really small, others really big. And also thinking in the role of the state in relation with other mechanism, because I'm thinking in the political crisis in Chile and the revolt that, interestingly enough, at least for me, it was at the beginning, there were high school students, the one that started the whole process, not even like young Marxists on their 20s. It were students like 15, 16 years old that they didn't have anything to lose. And I think that was something in favor of the process, because they knew in a way that they didn't have any future, so they don't have anything to lose, and they just start to collapse the subway system in Santiago. But what is interesting to me, in a way, is that the whole process of writing this new constitution, that it has a lot of issues, but it was, at least in paper, support by the state, but all the, how to say, like all the economical elite in Chile was the one that was opposite to that process, and they used the press to create a different narrative. And at the end, it wasn't the state the one that tried to stop this process of change. It was the economical power, allied with the right-wing parties, but mostly through the press. So I'm thinking a lot on the scale in relation with the problem, in this other aspect in society, like press or the economical powers that have this direct connection with the political power, and they can even have more power than the state in the process of deciding if we are going to change our political system or not, because at the end, and this is funny because I draw like the line of the, okay, we have legitimacy after dictatorship, then we go up into the crisis, but then we go back to the same state that before the crisis, nothing have changed in legal terms, but we don't have legitimacy. We have the same state without legitimacy, having passed through a crisis. So I think that the I don't know, the case of Chile, it's really interesting in those terms that you were talking, and also the role of art in how we construct or create this story to infuse with legitimacy these different positions. Because, for example, there were a lot of artists that they work around resentment, like they use it like a word, like with a lot of public interventions during the political crisis. But after the night where all the political parties get together in the House of Government during the night with not telling anyone, and they reach this really dark agreement, at the next day in the place where all the manifestation happened, there was this artistic intervention with the place covered with white fabric, all of it, and the word peace. And that aesthetic gesture like create this narrative that the agreement was good and we have like a clean start with peace to this new whole process. So I think that, I don't know, I was thinking in a lot of things because I think it's really, really interesting, all this, I don't know, way to understand the crisis. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Yeah, I think that certainly the state itself is not the only teller of legitimation stories. So for there to be any kind of gap between the state and the population, you know, as Koselleck says, there have to be other views that are current in the society. And those views will often come from other kinds of organizations, institutions, structures that have kind of different levels of relation to the state. You know, might be viewed as kind of part of the state from one point of view, or orbiting the state, or might be viewed as private from a more liberal orthodox point of view. So yes, definitely the particular legitimation stories, there's always a competition in civil society through lots of different organizations and institutions for influence over which stories the state's going to be held to. Because the stories that are ultimately the most important are not just the ones the state may want, they're also the ones that the state has to meet so that it can maintain its legitimacy. So there's always a kind of push-pull between the state and its different constituencies, and those constituencies want their particular preferred narratives to be the narratives that the state speaks in terms of. And they use all of those orbiting structures to influence the state to focus on their particular abstractions and their preferred conceptualizations of those abstractions. When on the point of students, I think one of the things in the United States in particular that's been very effective at managing dissent is the kind of college as a lottery ticket thing. College it used to be presented in the United States as a golden ticket. If you had a college degree, then you would be able to get a job. You would be okay. Even if you caused trouble while you were in school, when you got out, you'd be fine. And lots of people would kind of approve of the fact that you caused trouble, think it was cool that you caused trouble. It might even help you in some circles to get employed. Now it's viewed as a lottery ticket. Nobody has to hire you. And the fact that you may have caused trouble is a mark against you that may cause people to not want to hire you. And while it's not altogether likely that you're going to have everything that you might want out of a job, or that young people in the United States are told they're meant to get out of a job, a lot of young people think they have some chance at it. They can't let go of the possibility that they might have the lottery ticket and they might end up with the job that would actually make them happy. Many young people are prepared to say that most jobs in the United States are terrible, that the capitalist system is terrible, that most of the jobs are horrible and alienating and exploitative. But they'll hold out this hope that maybe their degree will be the lottery ticket that will get them one of the tiny number of jobs that maybe possibly are actually validating. And so to get someone to the stage where they're going to say the entire labor market is just alienation and exploitation, rather than 99.999% of it, except for the part that maybe I'll get with my lottery ticket degree. That's the step that it's very hard to push even people who are relatively left-wing in the States to make.
Great. Angus, you haven't had a chance to ask your question, so do you want to do that? And so we'll wrap it up after that.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for the lateness of the question. It took me a while to try to formulate my thoughts. It's sort of a two-part, but I think that Pancho's question was in line with the first part, which is, we're in Canada, and our understanding of the media for both Canada and the States has been to hold the government accountable. And so when you've talked about money being thrown by wealthy people, I sort of see that that's sort of been towards the media in part anyways, to frame the question, redirect it. And Pancho touched on the fact that therefore these crises either get soothed and deferred to arise again later, or we pass through them and nothing changes, but we all feel better. And so there's a distrust of the media because we felt that it's to hold the government accountable, but now it's here to take sides or gains favor. So part B, my second question is my understanding of the role of the media, has it always been this way? And is my understanding a myth that it used to hold the government accountable, but really it was going along with things, or have things really changed significantly in the last several decades in terms of the role of the media in influencing the people and keeping us compliant and complacent?
Yeah, so my inclination would be to say that in some senses, both sides of that coin are true. So there have always been, in the Cold War, people in the media who have been close contacts with agents of the state, who get their stories from agents of the state, and who tend to publish stuff on the basis of what those agents of the state inform them of. Lots of people at this point have come out and said, oh yes, I used to work in the FBI, and we used to plant stories in the media. I used to take out different journalists to lunch, and I would tell them things, and I would also tell the people they were likely to talk to the same story, so when they try to collaborate it, they'd think it's true and they'd publish it. I'd give them lots of good information and sneak in the things that I wanted them to publish that might not have been true. People at this point are on the record as having said that they did that. That said, I do think there are ways in which it has changed. One of the things that happened is the Watergate scandal. And I think the Watergate scandal created a certain image, hero image of the journalist that really affected a whole generation of journalists in the United States. They want to be the one who breaks the Watergate scandal. Now, the way you break the Watergate scandal is you have to be in close contact with members of the intelligence services, with members of the civil service. You have to have those people's trust. They have to like you, and they have to tell you things they don't tell anybody else. You have to be the first one to hear it, and ideally the only one to hear it, so that you can be the one who has all of the stories, and you can be the hero journalist who was the one who was able to break it. Now, for that to happen, not only do you have to trust state sources, but you have to trust state sources without really checking to see if other people are hearing the same stories, because you need to be first. You need to be the only one who's heard that story. And the internet contributes to that by further incentivizing being quick. So now, without checking other sources to see if you're being deceived, you tend to just run with it. So I think there's always been a tendency for the state to try to push particular lines in the media and try to get through networking between intelligence agents and journalists, particular narratives out. But now, because the journalist is desperate to be first, in part because of this hero myth around Watergate, in part because the internet and technology have changed the political economy of the media and given a big incentive to being first. There are people whose whole media career is now based around that they tend to be first. And those people are considered assets to the companies they work for. To be first, you have to just run with what you hear from that person. And if you don't run with it, they're going to tell somebody else. And they can use the fact of, well, I can talk to somebody else if you aren't going to run it, to get you to run what they want you to run. So I think that has been a factor. And then, of course, Donald Trump is the most recent factor insofar as Donald Trump attacked the journalists and made them feel that they were being treated as the enemy, and made many of them feel that they were in some way physically unsafe at his events. The people who covered him felt physically unsafe. And so they responded by becoming heavily political during his presidency in a way that exceeded their behavior, even in the Obama or Bush years, when I think many journalists were quite political and did tend to publish a lot of political stuff, but made more of an effort to cover it under a veneer of professionalism that was largely dropped in the last 5 or 7 years.
This is really excellent. I'm really ignorant of all these things, and I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I think this is like exactly, I mean, Pancho, you maybe feel the same way, like what we kind of trying to do with the art department. Like, this is an opportunity for us. I mean, not we all coming from different places, but to think about these ideas, how this reflects on what we're doing with our work and, the predicament of society at the moment. But yeah, just like an opportunity on a Sunday afternoon to think about things differently. So it's great. I'm really grateful to everybody who came as well. It's great to share ideas with you guys as well. And yeah, thank you so much, Benjamin.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I look forward to doing Liberty next week.
Awesome.